January 23, 1943, at 4 a.m., when the darkness over Ravensbrück was so thick it seemed the very air had frozen, Roxanne Volkov stood in line for roll call. Her legs, swathed in cold, already felt the ice beneath her feet. She could hear the taste of blood from the broken nose of a woman in the next barack, but she didn't turn around. That day, unlike other days, the SS doctor with the gold-rimmed glasses, whom everyone simply called the doctor, walked past the first 3 rows without looking up and stopped right in front of her. He observed her hands, hardened by forced labor, her fingers blackened by frostbite, and jotted something down in his notebook. Then he gave a brief signal to the guard. Roxanne didn't know what it meant, but when her number was called over the loudspeaker along with 12 others, she felt something break inside her. They weren't taken to the workshop as usual, but to a red brick building at the far end of the camp with nailed-down windows and a door that opened only from the inside. Behind that door began what historians would later call pseudo-medical experiments on civilian prisoners. But for Roxanne, at that precise moment, it meant only one thing: the end. Roxanne was born in a village in Burgundy to a family of schoolteachers. She grew up between the village school and the fields in a land where people didn't prepare for war, but for life. When the Germans occupied their region in 1940, her father was arrested for helping resistance fighters cross the demarcation line. He died in detention a few weeks later. Her mother succumbed to the harsh realities of war and deprivation during the winter of 1941. Roxanne was arrested not as a combatant, but as a suspect. During a check, a coded message intended for a local resistance network was found in her bag, but she didn't have time to destroy it. Initially sent to a transit camp, she was later deported to Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in the Third Reich. Among the 1,000 women who came from all over Europe, French women formed a significant group, but some of them, young and healthy, considered salvageable, attracted the particular attention of the SS doctors. The logic was cold and methodical. To test the limits of the female body subjected to extreme stress in order to adapt this data to the needs of the German army. But what was being studied was not resilience. It was the precise point at which a woman ceases to be a person. For the first week, Roxanne was observed. Every morning at 6 a.m., she was woken and taken to a white room where 2 orderlies took her temperature, pulse, and blood pressure, noting everything in heavy ledgers. They didn't speak, didn't answer, didn't look her in the eye. At first, she thought of a medical board. Perhaps she would be assigned to the infirmary. But the second week, everything changed. They took her to the basement. 10 bathtubs were lined up there, filled with ice water. "Get in," said the doctor. Roxanne went in. The shock was immediate. The water took her breath away. 3 minutes, then 5, then 10, the doctor circled her, observed her skin, touched her limbs, consulted a stopwatch. When her body stopped trembling and began to detach itself, they took her out, wrapped her up, and measured her again. Everything was measured: her heart rate, the loss of consciousness, the recovery time. The third week, they added heat. After the ice, they took her to a room where an open oven was burning. "Undress." She stood by the fire while he noted. Perspiration, temperature, skin reaction, then back to ice, then back to fire for cycles a day. Soon, Roxanne could no longer distinguish between hot and cold. Her skin became covered in purplish spots. Her hair fell out, her nails split, but the most frightening thing happened elsewhere. In her mind, she first forgot names, then faces, then her mother's. One day, she no longer recognized her own. The doctor noticed. He smiled and made a note: disorientation and memory loss during extreme temperature changes. Interesting. Among the 12 women selected with her was Anne, an 8-year-old Parisian nurse and former midwife. She was a quick learner. During the first bath, she whispered to Roxanne, "Breathe slowly, don't fight it. Pretend you're already gone." This advice saved lives and became their support. She knew how to feign fainting, how to slow her breathing, how to gain a few hours of respite. She spoke of her son, sent to stay with cousins in the unoccupied zone before her arrest. "He will live," she said. "As long as I hold on, he's growing." There was also Lucy, 20, from Brittany, an artist before the war. She secretly sketched what she saw on scraps of canvas: the baths, the fire, the doctors. "One day someone will see," she murmured. Natalie, a former physical education teacher, was forced to run in the icy courtyard in her nightgown until she collapsed. She ran because she knew that stopping was dying. And then there was Helene, 18, almost silent. One night, when Roxanne was delirious with fever, Helene placed her cold hand on her forehead. It was the first human touch in weeks. Then she whispered, "My grandma used to say that French women don't die here. They wait." What Roxanne and her companions were subjected to wasn't the isolated cruelty of a few psychopaths. It was a policy integrated into a program that the Nazis internally called Operation Western Front. In Berlin, at the Institute for Racial Hygiene, Dr. Segmund Raschke wrote reports on the ability of French prisoners to withstand extreme climatic conditions, cold and heat, that German soldiers struggled to endure during prolonged campaigns. This research was funded directly by Himmler, who was convinced that understanding the resistance mechanisms of French civilian populations accustomed to rationing, occupation, and silent endurance would optimize the survival of the Reich's troops. In camps scattered across occupied Europe, hundreds of similar experiments were conducted. At Auschwitz, they tested the effects of the FUS gene on Polish prisoners. At Dachau, they inoculated Italian prisoners with malaria. At Ravensbrück, French women served as models for the study of extreme thermal shock. Every morning, the doctor collected the data and transmitted it via encrypted line to Berlin. There, they plotted graphs, calculated averages, and wrote conclusions. The conclusions were simple. The French women's bodies withstood the cold longer than expected. But this didn't mean they were at their strongest. It meant they could be made to suffer for longer. This information wasn't just used for training soldiers. It was used to refine interrogation and torture methods. After the war, archives revealed documents detailing how to expose a human being to cold without causing immediate death. These methods were applied during interrogations in the camps. Roxanne and her companions weren't just victims. They were prototypes. Their suffering became a manual. The first turning point came at the end of February. The doctor announced that the experiment was entering a new phase. From now on, it wouldn't just be a matter of enduring the cold and the heat, but of learning how to do so. Each woman had to learn to control her breathing in order to slow her heart rate. This wasn't a test, it was preparation. He wanted French women to teach German soldiers how to survive. And the nurse understood immediately. They want us to become their instructors. Then they'll kill us to erase the evidence. She proposed a plan. Find the learning, progress slowly, feign failure by time. But the doctor anticipated this. He began to threaten. If you don't succeed in a week, your children, the ones you talk about at night, will suffer the same fate. The second turning point came in March. One night, after a particularly brutal menstrual cycle, 17-year-old Helene, from Normandy, didn't wake up. She simply stopped moving. The doctor came, examined her, and declared, "Organic amnesia with a fatal outcome." He was satisfied. It was the first death officially attributed to thermal shock. He ordered that the body not be removed but kept in a cold room for autopsy. Roxanne watched the frost form on her hair. The third turning point came in April. Lucy, the artist, was caught with her drawings. The doctor personally entered the barracks, tore her gown, and found the hidden canvas. He didn't get angry. He smiled. "Very well," he said. "From now on, you will draw what I order you to." He asked her to depict the women in the bathtubs, but not as they were. He demanded that she be smiling, relaxed, as if at a wellness retreat. Lucy refused. So he placed his hand on the burning patch of hair and pressed the young woman's fingers against it. "Draw where your fingers will disappear?" She drew. The fourth turning point was the most terrifying. In May, the doctor announced the entry into the final phase. 3 women were selected: Roxanne, Anne, and Natalie. They were led out of the camp to a wood near an abandoned hunting lodge. They were stripped completely naked and left overnight in the snow while the doctors observed them from a distance with optical devices. It was no longer an experiment. It was a game. He wanted to see which one would last the longest. And collapsed first, followed by Natalie. Roxanne remained alone, kneeling in the snow, staring into the darkness between the trees and catching glimpses of cigarette embers. She no longer thought of her home, nor of the war. She thought only of her next breath. Each inhale was a victory, each exhale a defeat. She learned to count her heartbeats, to slow them by will, to distance herself from her own body. It didn't make her stronger, it drained her. She watched and recounted her son's story each night and understood that and no longer saw his face. She saw Lucy drawing, her hand trembling, not from the cold, but because she no longer remembered how to hold a pencil. She saw Natalie running, knowing that she was fleeing her memories more than her tormentors. Roxanne stopped crying, the tears frozen on her cheeks. She stopped speaking, words lost their meaning. She ceased to be Roxanne. She became Specimen 47B. That's how the doctor recorded her in his register. Specimen 47B, high resistance, loss of identity 73%. One day, she saw this entry in the journal left open. She felt no anger. She simply thought, 73%. That means there's still 27% left. And in her 20s, she retained the image of her mother, the smell of warm bread, the sound of snow underfoot the day her father was arrested, a fire that could neither be stoked nor extinguished. Each time the doctor ordered her to stand, she stood up because standing up was another way of saying, I'm still here, I still remember. She understood that this was the final cycle. She stood at the edge of the bathtub, stared into the dark water, then raised her head and looked directly into the camera the doctor had set up to film. She said slowly, clearly in French, I will not die today. I will die when I decide to. Then she let herself fall into the water. She didn't struggle. She simply lay at the bottom, her eyes open, watching the beams of light dance above her. She counted 1, 2. The doctor began to fidget. He shouted, Get her out. No one moved. She continued to count. She saw her mother standing by a river. She saw her father waving to her. Then they pulled her out of the water. She wasn't breathing. The doctor leaned forward, pressed her ear to his chest. Then she opened her eyes and said, Conte, that's my record. She had won, but her victory was as empty as her gaze. After that day, the experiments ceased, not out of pity, but simply because Rashka had obtained all the data he needed. In his final report, he wrote, The French prisoners exhibit remarkable resistance to thermal shock, but a progressive loss of human bearings. Recommendation: possible use as a training aid, to be excluded from any social reintegration. Roxanne and the survivors were transferred to an ordinary barracks. They were no longer specimens. They had become mere prisoners again, but they could no longer work. Roxanne could no longer hold a spoon, and had forgotten how to tie a knot. Natalie no longer ran. She sat, stared into space, and waited. They did not wait for liberation. They waited to cease to exist. When the Allied troops arrived in early 1945, this barracks was the last to be opened. The door was locked from the inside. When it was forced open, 12 women were found sitting side by side, dressed in rags, their eyes vacant. They were alive, but when spoken to in French, none of them responded. They had forgotten the language, forgotten their names, forgotten themselves. Roxanne was transferred to a military hospital near Paris. The doctors didn't understand. Her body was alive, but her eyes were lifeless. She didn't react to noise, light, or pain. She lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then, 3 months later, she spoke. Her first word was cold, the second mother, the third sorry. She lived for another 40 years. But every winter, she asked that the room temperature never exceed 15 degrees Celsius because the heat reminded her of her hair, and her hair reminded her of what came next. She never spoke of the camp. She would only say, There, I learned to breathe and I forgot why. In the French archives opened in the 1990s, Rachk's report was found. It contained the names of the 12 French women used in the experiments. Next to each name was a note: used, eliminated, lost. Roxanne Volkov appeared as Specimen 40. At the bottom of the page, in another handwriting, was added, survivor, found in a military hospital, condition, amnesia, erasure of identity. Recommendation, extended. She died in 1985, alone in a small suburban apartment. On the table, they found a piece of paper with a single sentence on it. I remember forgetting, but what did I forget? She was buried under the name Roxanne Volkov. But on the headstone, they engraved a birth date that she herself had chosen. July 12, 1921, the day she was born a second time. The day she understood that surviving wasn't a victory, it was an obligation. The obligation to remember, the obligation to bear witness, the obligation not to let them win. Because he didn't just want to kill, he wanted to erase you. But memory isn't a body. You can't freeze it or burn it. It lives on in every person who hears this story and doesn't look away. The question isn't how much one can endure. The question is how much one can remember.